Hi, everyone. I'd like to just welcome you here tonight. I'm Brian Schiff. I'm the director of the George and Irina Schaeffer Center for the Study of Genocide, Human Rights, and Conflict Prevention. And tonight we are very happy to welcome Taline Papazian, who's going to speak to us tonight. The title of her talk is Over Yet Unresolved, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict from self-determination to ethnic cleansing. And this is a subject that should be on the news. We've just been discussing before how difficult it is to sometimes, especially within the English press, to get up to date news. And I think that it's something that, that the community would like to understand better, what's going on with events, and to try to understand what some of the problems are, the problematic, les enjeux that are happening right this second, some of the history, etc. So we're really happy to have Taline here tonight to talk about this. Taline is a professor at Sciences Po X, and she's also written a book specifically about the Karabakh entitled L'Arménie à l'épreuve de feu, forger l'État à travers la guerre. And in English, it would be something like Armenia, the trial of fire, building the state through war. And then the other thing that you should know about Taline as well, too, is that she runs the Armenia Peace Initiative. So we're very pleased to have you tonight, and we're very pleased to have a lot of students to come to this event tonight. So welcome, Taline.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Brian. And thank you to all of you who have come at 5 p.m. After a long day of work to listen to this complicated question of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. We'll try to keep it simple, but you may know that one of the difficulties when you are a specialist of a question is that you sometimes intend to forget how for non-specialists some things might be a lot more complicated than they seem. So I will try to keep my talk short so that we have time then for questions and answers, and really feel free to ask any questions, including those that you may think, oh, this is a silly question, I'm not going to ask that. There is no silly question, and the floor is going to be open really for all your questions. So I told you it's a long history, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. This conflict is more than 100 years old, but be easy. I'm not going to do the 100 years in 10 minutes. And you will see that starting from 1988, we already have plenty element of history and politics and geopolitics to absorb. So in its modern phase, this conflict has started or restarted in 1988. That is the end of the Soviet Union. So you have at that time in the Soviet Union a new Secretary General who is Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev has a program of perestroika and glasnost, which is basically a program of transparency and some reforms. And on the wave of this liberalization, quote unquote, modest, but still liberalization, Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh are going to put back on the table a question that has been bothering them for decades, actually, and basically saying that, in the region where we are, which is the autonomous region of Nagorno-Karabakh inside the Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan, we feel that we are being discriminated, that we can't have access to our language and culture as we wished, that the numbers of our population is gradually decreasing in terms of ratio. So you see here, I have put 1989. In the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, you have 75% Armenian population, 25% Azerbaijani. But to compare, at the beginning of the Soviet period, Armenians in the region were 95% and Azerbaijanis 5%. So for Armenians, there is a clear tendency that as a result, both of Soviet nationalities policies, and as a result of Azerbaijani policies coming from Baku to the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, the result, or the possible result, is that one day they're going to be a minority in the region, and that's a prospect that is raising many anxieties. Let's put it like that. So the movement for asking for a change of administrative borders within the USSR, I mean that Armenians are basically asking that the autonomous region of Nagorno-Karabakh is transferred to the Soviet Socialist Republic of Armenia. And I'm insisting on this point because at the time in the Soviet Union, changes in administrative borders is not so much of a big deal as it will be once all these republics become independent in 1991. So during the 3 years from 1988 to the dismemberment of the Soviet Union in 1991, this is basically the form of this movement. They claim for reunification with Armenia. And in Armenia proper, the Nagorno-Karabakh movement will trigger the national liberation movement, whereby Armenians in Armenia will gradually claim that what they want in short to medium term is independence from the Soviet Union. And it's important to take these two aspects of the question into account because it's like two sides of one coin for Armenians. You have one side of the coin that's the Nagorno-Karabakh question, and the other side of the coin, which is the independence of the Armenian state on the wings, let's say, of that movement. Then, the question is not resolved by Gorbachev, and I am fast forwarding 3 years. The USSR is coming to its end in 1991, and the two Soviet socialist republics of Armenia and Azerbaijan find themselves in a state of total warfare at the end of 1991. That first war, in which the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians will play a very important role. Basically, what they will get is support from Armenia, but they will have a primary role in waging this war against Azerbaijan. So you have a total war for 3 years and a half. 3 years and a half. This war is one of the bloodiest wars of the Soviet Union. After the Chechen War, obviously, Chechen War had far bigger numbers in terms of casualties and everything, but 30,000 30,000 people died on both sides, which is a big number, given you have 4 million in Armenia at the time, 165,000 Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, and you had 6 million, 7 million in Azerbaijan at the end of the Soviet period. You also have in total more than 1 million refugees and displaced persons from that, in both sides. I'm totally numbers here. So it's a heavy war that ends with a ceasefire. Well, the USSR, former USSR, is, I guess, a well-known region for the number of armed conflicts that it has given to the world since its dismemberment, and it's for a very good reason. The reason for this dates back from the Soviet nationalist policies and the way that specifically the early Bolshevik leaders, and Stalin in particular, designed the placements of nationalities on the territory of the Soviet Union. And so that's very important to have in mind in this, how do you say a tableau in English? In this table, thank you. In this table, you have comparisons with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are the two conflicts that are on the Georgian territory since the beginning of the 1990s. Just for comparison, I'm not going to go into the details for, just in order to save time, but you see the history of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which has not stopped during the Soviet period. Every time Karabakh Armenians had a small window of opportunity, they would come up with whatever instruments were at their disposal at the time. It could be petitions, it could be letters, it could be demonstrations. So, that issue keeps coming back. It's over, but it's not resolved, even now. And in February 1988, there is a very important vote that is voting for unification. The answer coming from Azerbaijan is 3 pogroms. I've put one, but there are 2 others. So one in February 1988, the others 1989, 1990. So first response is violence, and the second response is that Baku decides to abolish the statute of autonomy of the Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous region. So 2 types of response that are going to be very important for future, how can I put that, for the future process of violence and armed violence in the region. There is no negotiation, to put it shortly. Then you have the independence of all the former Soviet republics and the declaration of independence of Karabakh that is not recognized by any other state. That happens in 1991. There is a referendum. People vote for secession from the USSR, not from Azerbaijan, from the USSR. One way of looking at the problem is to look at Nagorno-Karabakh as a decolonization problem. We could say it's double decolonization problem, because one is how to decolonize from the USSR, and then more recently is how to decolonize from Azerbaijan. The specificity, I mean, sometimes people wonder, why have Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians chosen to leave Nagorno-Karabakh very recently, after bombing in September and so on and so forth. There are many elements of answer, including Armenophobia, including the ultra-violence, including the regime in Azerbaijan. But one very important element of answer is that never in the history of that region have Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh live under direct tutelage from Baku. There was always a third party that was sort of mediating, putting some rules, putting some rules of the game, so that there was no direct imposition of power. And I think that was the red line for many Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, and one reason why they all chose to left very recently. So quickly, at the end of the First War, you had a situation where the forces of Nagorno-Karabakh had not only maintained their control over the former autonomous region, but also conquered a number of surrounding territories on Azerbaijani territory, and also, here in yellow, lost a portion of the region. So it's always a two-way street, if I can put it like that. And those territories around the region were supposed at some point in the negotiation process to serve as an exchange territories for a status. Unfortunately, that hasn't worked for many good and bad reasons, and peace has not won in the region. So you had, from 1994 to 2020, 26 years of ceasefire. Sometimes in the press, Nagorno-Karabakh was depicted as a frozen conflict, which it was not frozen at all. It was more of a low-intensity conflict that was unregulated, where you had no observers, where the ceasefire, nobody was reporting on it, and basically that claimed hundreds of lives every year, but out of the radar of everyone that matters. This is a picture of Republic of Mountainous Karabakh, the big sign when you entered from the Latin corridor. Obviously that sign doesn't exist anymore, and you have here two flags. And it's almost the same. A small map of a small blitzkrieg war that happened in 2016, at the end of which small portions of territory were reconquered by Azerbaijani forces. I'm fast forwarding. This is a picture from a fieldwork in 2016 in Yerevan, where you see there were many signs like this. It was just after the 4-day war. I am Artsakh. Artsakh is the Armenian name for Nagorno-Karabakh. I am Artsakh. If I am not on the front line, then I am participating in the defense of my country from the back. I am by my soldier. I took this picture because I was working and I'm still working on non-state defense actors in Armenia, and I thought this sentence was quite illustrative. It still is, actually. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is also a very small conflict, small not for the people who undergo that conflict, obviously, but small when you look at it from Paris or New York or whatever, that is taken in the spirals of larger, bigger wars, or also wars, we could say, that matter more in terms of international geopolitics or economics or whatever. And again, this is true since the dissolution of the USSR, but it has known variable intensity over time. So obviously, sometimes you don't have those big wars impacting so much, and sometimes they are impacting very, very much, and that's the case now with the war in Ukraine. But we could also say with the war between Israel and Hamas. So there are times when this focal is more valid than others. Since 2021, no, excuse me, I forgot something important. The 2020 war, which is the most recent big war between the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. So that was a 44-day war in 2020 that completely put things upside down, because this time you had an Azerbaijani victory. Azerbaijan regained its control over the surrounding regions of Nagorno-Karabakh. It also gained control over a part of the Nagorno-Karabakh region per se. Again, refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh going to Armenia. 5,000 people died on the Armenian ranks, probably 7,000 in the Azerbaijani ranks, but we don't really know because they're keeping their figures secret. And that's a massive change of the whole situation in the South Caucasus, because, for a number of reasons, but because Russia is bringing troops in the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, supposedly to keep the ceasefire holding and to guarantee that Armenians in Artsakh can continue to live in the region and to have their physical existence not put at risk so much. And the second reason is because Turkey, which is a staunch supporter and has a strategic partnership with Azerbaijan, also gains from this war, because through Azerbaijan as a proxy, Turkey is able to put a firmer foot in the South Caucasus. So the shockwaves of the 2020 war are actually reverberating, we could say, up to the very latest events that resulted in the ethnic cleansing of the Nagorno-Karabakh region. And for Armenia, since 2021, you have two levels of conflict. You have an open, low-intensity conflict with Azerbaijan, so the traditional adversary, and you have a political, not open, hybrid form of war that Russia is waging against Armenia. So Armenia is in a very complicated situation at the moment, because Azerbaijan is partly being used as a proxy by Russia against the sovereignty and independence of Armenia, and Russia is also directly putting a threat on Armenia's independence and sovereignty. On the paper, Russia and Armenia are strategic partners. They are supposed to be allies. And still very often in the West, Armenia is perceived as being a Russian ally, even a vassal. The real situation on the ground is quite different. In 2021, you have Azerbaijani armed forces that are advancing on the territory of Armenia, and they are conquering some territories in Armenia proper. And Russia refuses to abide by its obligations for its partner, and says, "Oh, I don't know what is going on actually, so I can't do anything." And do you have a border with Azerbaijan, by the way? We're not so sure. that's one way of waging this hybrid warfare. And again, very often, a misreading or a misconception that you find, particularly in the Western world, is that, well, maybe things are not so great between Armenia and Russia, but that's because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. No, that started in 2021. Russia was not waging a war against Ukraine at that time, but it was already starting to put Armenia's sovereignty at risk and at direct peril. And this is really the stake that is in this conflict now. All the more so since September of this year, but I'll come to that in a moment. So this is the map after the 2020 war. You see those are the regions that Azerbaijan reconquered or regained as a result of the war. Here in yellow you have the Nagorno-Karabakh region that remained after the 2020 war, and you have Armenia here. See, very narrow, very risky. Casualties, I'm flying over. You'll ask me if you want. Since the end of the 44-day war, we have a strategy from Azerbaijan to very gradually, chunk after chunk, come on the territory of Armenia and put under question the very existence of that state in terms of its borders, in terms of legitimacy of its territory, even in terms sometimes of legitimacy of its existence. And so you have a series of pushes of the military forces of Azerbaijan against Armenia, few hundred deaths every time. And against Nagorno-Karabakh, the strategy was a little bit different. After violations of the ceasefire during the first year, 2021, you have a blockade of the region of Nagorno-Karabakh that is put in place in December 2022. 9 months of blockade. Blockade means literally that people in the region had no access to normal, rations of bread every day, or soap to wash their hands or wash their kids, or medication, or hospitals, or schools. So the situation was quite complicated. And then 1920 September 2023, there is something that is called, it's so-called anti-terrorist operation that is decided by Baku that actually takes the form of bombing the region for more than 24 hours, as a result of which, well, the small self-defense army of Nagorno-Karabakh capitulate and says that, okay, we're dissolving our self-defense army, we're dissolving our representative structures that we have put in place in the past 30 years, and 3 days after, the Lachin corridor that links the Nagorno-Karabakh region to Armenia opens up, and people starts fleeing the region en masse. So 100,000 people in the span of 7 days arrive on the territory of Armenia. On this map, you have an illustration of what territories have been occupied since 2021 by Azerbaijani forces on the territory of Armenia. You see in the small dots of color on the map. 2021, 2022, 2023. We're waiting for the next one. And that's a map of the bombings in September of this year against the region of Nagorno-Karabakh. So, very soon it was obvious for people in the region that the Azerbaijani forces were seizing the whole of the enclave, and that the only solution was to capitulate. In 1989, Soviet academician Andrei Sakharov, Nobel Peace Prize at the time, had described very adequately the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. He said that for Armenians, the Nagorno-Karabakh question is a question of life and death, of existence. For Azerbaijan, it's a question of, let me try to translate, how do you say, of pride, orgueil, of pride, yes. And I think this picture taken just recently illustrates this perfectly. On the left side, you have the main place in Stepanakert, the capital city of Nagorno-Karabakh, where you see that people have basically left everything and flown for their lives. You know, you have strollers, you have the chair from the office, you have, well, everything that forms everyday lives of people. You know, that is just abandoned in panic because people are just hoping that the Latin corridor is going to open and that they are going to be able to escape. And on the right side, this is a picture from Ilham Aliyev, president of Azerbaijan for the last 20 years. He arrived in Karabakh in a triumphant, visit just a few days ago in Stepanakert. He first trampled the Artsakh flag, and then he raised the Azerbaijani flag. And this is really the illustration of what motivates Armenians, and I think what motivates at least the Azerbaijani leadership, not all Azerbaijani people, thank God, but the Azerbaijani leadership for sure. In just a few minutes, that's a lot of info, I know, so now I'm going to stop here, and all your questions are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, I think that there's lots of questions. I wanted to first open up the floor to students. If you had something to say or in response, or if you had a question that you'd like to ask Taline.
Good evening. Well, first I would like to thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was very informative and it was great all in all. And my question is, what do you think forced Nicole Pashinyan to leave the territory of Artsakh recently?
To leave?
Not to leave, but to...
Let it go?
Yeah, let it go. Thank you.
Well, a pure assessment of realism. The disbalance of forces between Azerbaijani military and Armenia's military is like 1 to 10. I don't have exact numbers, but approximately. The second reason is that Azerbaijan was calculating on a provoked response from Armenia, and it was, I think we can say it safely, it was hoping that Armenia would actually respond militarily to what was going on in Nagorno-Karabakh, you know, saying that this is our compatriots, we have to do something, we have to intervene. And that would have been the ideal pretext to launch another armed aggression against Armenia, not against Nagorno-Karabakh, against Armenia. Why? Because Azerbaijan has, among its territorial objectives of the moment, to at least, there are a couple of levels of objectives, but the very basic level is to open a strip of land here that would connect Azerbaijan mainland to Nakhichevan, which is an autonomous republic of Azerbaijan, but you see it's separated from Azerbaijan. Thank you, Stalin, once more, from Azerbaijan proper. And so Azerbaijan has been asking for a corridor here that would reciprocate the Latin corridor that used to link Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia. To which Armenia has always said, we want and we agree to open all roads of the region, you know, to have commerce, to have tourists, to have flows of trade, whatever you want. But not a corridor that would deprive Armenia of its sovereignty on this territory, which means if there is a special route, Armenia is the owner of that route. And you know, we can agree on many technicalities, on what that should be, special transit route maybe, you know, there are many ways that the technicity can help us solve that question. But no extraterritorial corridor over the territory of the Republic of Armenia. Azerbaijan is not happy with that response. And Russia is not happy with that response either, which is the reason why I said that Russia is using Azerbaijan as a proxy in this issue. So that's the the two answers to your question.
Thank you for the lecture. It was very enlightening. My question is that how would you define ethnic cleansing, especially when the other side, the aggressor, Azerbaijan, says that we're just attacking terrorists in the region? Yeah, thank you.
There is no juridical, legal definition of ethnic cleansing. It's not like genocide that has been codified in international, okay? But the perfect example and how ethnic cleansing came to be described very acutely by the international community was with the wars in former Yugoslavia, so in the 1990s. And especially UN mandated commissioners of experts during they had a series of reports at the time, describing what was going on. And in the very last report, the description was that ethnic cleansing is so a policy that is divided by an ethnic or religious group against another ethnic or religious group, either by violent or terrorist means, in order to remove that group from the area where it lives. I think that description fits perfectly, right? The official argument of Azerbaijan is that indeed it was launching an anti-terrorist operation, and that supposedly the 100,000 people of that region were all terrorists. They had a small, self-defense army. And even when you look at the weapons that were handed over after the defeat, it's like, wow, really? That was what you were after? Yes, I saw you earlier. Yes.
Professor Papazian, thank you for being here, and thank you for raising awareness about an ongoing conflict that is not as prioritized by the international community or the media. And many thanks to the Schaeffer Center for particularly funding my research in Armenia, examining links between the causes of genocide and ecocide. I'm a graduate student here in international management, and I'm in the sustainability track. And I have lived through the first Karabakh war in the early 90s. I was in Armenia at the time. So we live in precarious times. The triangle of conflict, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Israel, Palestine, and Russia and Ukraine, the tip of the triangle points to the west. And the recent flare-ups between Israel and Hamas underlines the urgency for sustainable peace talks. Mm-hmm. A few days ago, Israeli classmate of mine, Natasha, during a French class, asked to speak about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but to her surprise, she discovered the students and the people in general are conflict fatigued. She found it very difficult to exert deep compassion out of her peers. Quickly, the sympathizers of the Palestinian cause pointed out the ongoing annexation of Palestine by Israel, and what was meant to be a five-minute conflict update turned into a surprisingly constructive forum for solutions exploring long-term sustainable peace. Mm-hmm. She realized that the part of the problem is that we, in general, and those who support Israel don't speak up until shit hits the fan. Excuse my French. Mainly, other than a general, we don't support the current right-wing Israeli government. We aren't engaged in crafting sustainable solutions for peace. It is admirable that the Schaeffer Center for the Study of Genocide, Human Rights, and Conflict Prevention is key, has invited you to speak at AUP about the cause beyond the Holocaust, but the Israeli-Palestinian and Armenian-Azeri conflicts are more entangled than meets the eye. As I was explaining to Natasha, my Israeli classmate, I wanted conversations like these to be kept alive before catastrophes. Conversations like, why is Israel selling state-of-the-art kamikaze drones to a genocidal dictatorship of Azerbaijan that commits ethnic cleansing in the South Caucasus? Both the Jewish and the Armenian people have experienced genocide. In fact, the League of Nations and Professor Lemkin, who coined the term genocide after World War II, cited the 1915 Armenian massacres committed by Turkey as precedent for statehood for Israel. So the blueprint of genocide and ethnic cleansing aren't difficult to recognize. So here's my question. What do you think the center should do? Should the Schaeffer Center for Conflict Prevention do more? Maybe fund a think tank advising the Israeli government to stop directly or inadvertently supporting ethnic cleansing in South Caucasus by selling arms to Azerbaijan. What do you think the center should do?
Yeah, because I don't feel I'm entitled to speak in the name of the center. I can give my opinion in general terms to your question, and I think you are right that if you look at the question in terms of morality and values, and I know those notions are discarded in geopolitics and international relations, but yeah, it doesn't make sense that Israel is, I would say, not adopting an honest and a decent position when it comes to the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict. And for example, even if you could say trade is trade, for example, maybe stop trade once it has been proven that, the reason why and the objectives for which these arms were used. We understand the Iranian issue for Israel, and when you have an Iranian leader that is saying that the Zionist regime should die, I understand Israel's concern about this statement. But again, as I said, from a moral or value point of view, and I think that people who have known genocides are obliged to have some morality. Maybe other people could spare that, but as people who have known genocides, I don't think we should discard morality. So yeah, that would be, sorry, just a bit emotional answer also. But the Schaeffer Center, I'm leaving it to you.
Another question?
I had a question. So you talked about Azerbaijan wanting that lower part of Armenian. It was one of their goals.
Mm-hmm.
You said they had multiple goals. What are the other goals that they have? Well, obviously, getting back, taking that region.
That's done.
Yeah, yeah. But what are their other goals?
It's hard to say for sure because when you have you always need to make a difference between political discourse even of a despot who usually does what he says, but still it's political discourse. It means that there are reasons of convincing or maintaining legitimacy for its internal audience. First, that strip of land could go here, but it could also go from here. And in that case, it's not only the south, it's the south and the center. Armenia is 29,000 square kilometers, so it's a very small country. The second thing is that, the actual occupation dots are coming from here and here. And when in a number of discourse that are regularly given by Ilham Aliyev, but other members also of his government, very top figures of the government, you have territorial pretensions that go to Lake Sevan, which is here, up to Yerevan, which is sometimes considered as being an Azerbaijani city and claimed as such. So we don't really know up to where there are real pretenses and up to where it's for internal purposes. But the problem is that as long as you don't have a peace treaty, everything is possible.
You've got a question for Taline?
I actually have a handful of questions, so stop me when. So first of all, what's the updated number of refugees that have left the region?
100,000
100,000.
and a few hundreds more.
And then have they mostly gone into Armenia, or have they also gone abroad?
For now, they have mostly gone to Armenia, but the concern of Armenians is that they remain in Armenia and they don't go abroad.
And then I've been reading about sort of political apathy in Armenia vis-a-vis the government, and so I'm wondering, you're Armenian, you live in Paris, right?
Yeah, well, I
So-
go to Armenia a couple times a year.
No, I know. I only asked because I just wonder what the there's the diaspora, and then there are the people living in Armenia. And what I wonder is the relationship between the two, and what the diaspora focuses on versus what's actually happening on the ground in Armenia. Does that make sense?
Yes, but super complicated question.
Okay. Fair enough. No, because I think it's easy. I mean, I don't know. I'm not part of a diaspora, but I think, once we leave our country, once we leave our home, even if we're still tied to it, even if we go back on a frequent basis, we're not there Monday through Friday, or the whole week. And so I just wonder what the relation is between the diaspora and the people that are actually in Armenia every day of the week. But if that's way too complicated, we can.
I will not be able to answer comprehensively, not at all, but just few elements of the puzzle. Armenia is 3 million people. The diaspora is probably around 8. It's all over the planet. You have 400,000 in France, but you have almost 2 million in the US. You have 2 million in Russia. All those communities are vastly different. In Europe, communities are somewhat similar, but Armenians in Russia are very different. Their links to the home country is also different. Their links to Armenia are different. They're closer geographically. They are closer mentally in a way. So I mean, it's super difficult to answer your question. But what I can tell you, the diaspora is going through one of its biggest traumas in the past 3 years. You have the word genocide that sometimes come in the discourse of Armenians of diaspora. I have a personal opinion on whether it is appropriate to use that word or not, but the fact that it resurfaces means something. And it's also a trauma because it's another portion of ancestral homeland that has gone out of their hands. So, I mean, for all these reasons, it's a very complicated period, and there is no unity of the goal or of the objectives or what Armenians should do, etc. at the moment. So that makes the answer to your question even more complicated. Yeah, I will stop here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you again for being here today. I haven't fully formed this question in my head, so if I stumble out, I apologize.
Don't worry.
But I'm currently a master's student in the Human Rights and Data Science program, and I'm relatively new to the human rights sector, and was not very familiar with this conflict, which is exactly why I showed up today. And you spoke a bit about how, this conflict isn't necessarily one being covered by the media as on such a large scale as maybe some others. And we've spoken about how sometimes conflicts can be fashionable in a way for the media and maybe à la mode. And so I see that this is maybe the public response or maybe a global media response. But do we find that conflicts such as this receive a similar response in, say, the United Nations or through the legal mechanisms by which we can potentially combat some of the real issues here? Do we find that the responses to conflicts like this, not in the media, but also legally in a geopolitical global law scale, receive a similar reaction in terms of it being fashionable?
No, the response is awful. I mean, it's a very simplistic term, but when the UN itself is a prisoner of the geopolitical rivalries, especially among the UN permanent security members. And every time that the Karabakh question has come up to the UN Security Council discussion since the inception of the blockade in December 2022, no resolution, not even a common declaration, not anything could ever be proposed, because you have Russia, the United States, France, let's take only these three, okay? Let's not even take the larger group, but they cannot find common language about a single issue at this moment. Even when it comes to fundamental human rights, and there should be an unequivocal response, but doesn't happen like that. Yeah, no, not the media and not the international legal instruments.
Just follow up on, are there any legal mechanisms that people have been trying? Just to follow up on that, are there legal avenues that people have been going order to prosecute this?
Right now?
Yes.
Yes, you have the International Court of Justice, and Armenia has very recently become a member of the statute of the Rome Statute, because Armenia wants to, you know, prosecute for all the war crimes that have been committed, including on its own territory, for the past 3 years, that have gone completely unpunished, unnoticed. But it's the beginning of a very, very long process, a process on which Armenia will be very badly armed if, for example, tomorrow the sovereignty and the independence of the state is lost. And then the only thing you can have is a diaspora and the Armenian cause, like Armenians have, you know, done for decades. And that's not a route that I hope we will know, because it's not a route that leads anywhere.
I was just wondering if you have a more updated number of how many Armenians are left in Artsakh now.
Yes, most recent numbers say 8 to 40 people, individuals, either who could not leave because they are they don't have the capacity physically to leave, or they're Russians, so they don't want to leave, or some of them have said, you know, we are old and we'd rather die here than resettle and die somewhere else.
I'm her dad. First of all, thank you so much for the talk.
I'm happy.
Yes. Could you talk for a moment about the failure of, first of all, Armenian leadership? We had 30 years to try to come to some place where there could be some agreement. When we were in a much better negotiating position, they could have made some kind of a deal. I suspect that in Key West, there could have been a deal, except both leaders probably could not go back to their own people and say, this is the deal. I suspect, I don't know that. So can you talk about the failure of Armenian leadership, number one, to come to some kind of agreement before this moment?
Mm-hmm.
And also, it seems to me that because this conflict has ended in violence and not a negotiation, that is still a potentially open conflict. If we look at the long view, in 20 years, when the gas station in Baku runs out of oil, and perhaps Armenia gets more developed economically, there could be a change in the power dynamic. And because this was solved in a violent way without negotiation, it seems to me it's a potentially open conflict again down the road. And so can you talk, address that and say, there's no Armenians left in Artsakh. Will there always be no Armenians in Artsakh?
Thank you for this question. It's the question of responsibilities is very important. It's crucial. There was Key West, but actually in Key West, one of the major problems was the Mehri option, which was the equivalent back in the time of the Zangezur corridor, so the corridor that would pass in the south of Armenia, and for that reason, the Key West talks did not go further than talks. So actually, if there was a moment when everything might have been possible, it was 1997. So we were 3 years after the ceasefire, and the Armenian government of the time was really keen on negotiating and on finding a compromise. That moderate government was ousted by a velvet coup, by leaders that found that they were too much compromising. And so, long story short. And after that, Armenia fooled itself in thinking that the conflict was over, whereas, as you very well said, something that has been dealt with through violent means cannot be considered as resolved. It was not the case at the time, and it's not the case now. And yes, the street to revanchism is wide open, and I think Aliyev is perfectly aware of that, and that's why Aliyev doesn't want to stop. Because it's either you sign a peace deal and maybe you have a chance for the region to, turn the page and do something differently, or you don't. But then in that case, you'd better take precautions so that in 10 years from now, you don't have Armenians that, raise the question again. So that's where we are, I think, and that's why the threats are so big right now. That's also why the Armenian government is desperately trying to find diplomatic means and find allies on the international arena so that Aliyev is constrained to sign some sort of agreement with very few incentives to do so. So I don't know, but this is where we are.
Nakhichevan used to also belong historically to Armenia. Nakhichevan also historically used to belong to Armenia, and there's now no history of it evident, right? They wiped everything away. And in Artsakh we have monasteries and churches dating back to the 4th century and such a rich history. Is there anything that can be done to preserve these churches or monasteries? Because Aliyev's wife is in charge of UNESCO, right? So what do you think can be done? Nothing.
It's complicated. I don't know what to tell you. I don't know. For at this moment, Artsakh is a black hole, right? Like nobody can even access even the UN mission that supposedly came after the ethnic cleansing was mandated by Baku, and it was not a properly formed team of UN. So at this moment, I have no hope in international organizations. Maybe the picture will change in I don't know when. But I mean, I am sorry, I don't have an answer to your question. Yes, it will probably be erased, or either it will probably be transformed, because the Azerbaijani strategy of asserting its national identity works not only through erasure, it also works through transformation. So you transform an Armenian church into a Caucasian Albanian church. You attribute that Caucasian Albanian church to the minority of Udi, who is present in Azerbaijan, and you say it's not Armenian, it's Caucasian Albanian, it's Udi, and therefore it's Azerbaijani. So this whole, very twisted but very astute way of rewriting the history of monuments, we are going to see it. Two questions.
In a maybe unfortunately hypothetical world, what would have to take place for Aliyev to sign a peace deal? What would have to come together?
Probably two things. One thing, he received so much pressure from the outside world that he is keener on discussing than on waging a war. And the second is Armenia receives so much diplomatic and military support that it's a little less weak than it is at the moment. And again, Aliyev thinks preferable to discuss rather than waging a war. Those two we don't have at the moment. No, oh sorry, the lady here, Constance had a question. Yes, yes, Constance had a question.
I had two questions. You said it's a question of pride for Azerbaijan, but economically too. Is there something special for them to gain controlling this area? And about Russia, before Russia left, didn't support anymore since 2021. Before that, you had concretely Russian troops present, and they were key, right, to protect Karabakh.
Okay, I will explain. So in terms of resources, some water and some mines. But it's not like Nagorno-Karabakh is a place where you would pray for the natural resources of the region, especially when you have so much oil and gas. So that's first question. And the second is, in Armenia proper, you have a Russian military base that has been in Gyumri, which is on the border between Armenia and Turkey since 1992. That military base is part of the security, architecture, and alliance between Armenia and Russia that has been building up in the 1990s for the most part of it. Because basically Armenia was waging a war to support Nagorno-Karabakh. in its struggle, and therefore it felt that it had at least to neutralize a potential threat coming from Turkey. So that's the reason for the main reason for the Russian alliances here. In 2020, when you have the 44-day war, Russia doesn't intervene, which is considered as normal because Nagorno-Karabakh is not part of the alliance treaty, okay? But the real problem starts in 2021 when you have incursions on Armenia's territory and Russia refuses to intervene, and then you have a crisis that is starting to really boil between Yerevan and Moscow. That answers your question?
I just didn't understand the Turkey. Who was afraid of the Turkey?
Armenia felt, because Armenia has two closed borders. Turkey closed its border with Armenia in 1993. Azerbaijan never opened its border with Armenia. So Armenia felt that a threat might be coming from Turkey. You probably know that historically the relations are complicated between Armenia and Turkey. So there hasn't been diplomatic normal relations between the two countries for the last, what may but 30 and plus years. So that's the reason for the Russian presence. So I'm jumping just one step ahead. The key to sort of diluting all this security problem is obviously to have relations that are normalized with Turkey. Very difficult with nowadays Turkey, but still a necessity. Other questions? Yes?
Thank you. Thank you, Taline. Perhaps for the audience, for those who are not familiar with the topic, you could elaborate a bit of the internal aspects, the internal aspects concerning Armenia about of this issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, because of course since the independence of Armenia, the independence was gained more or less in times of crisis about the Karabakh.
Yes.
And during the 30 years of independence, this issue was a key issue in internal politics. You alluded to this in your presentation, but perhaps you could elaborate a bit about the recent changes in the Armenian internal politics after 2018, after the so-called Velvet Revolution, and how much it can explain, to what extent it can explain the current developments.
Yes, thank you, Boris, for pointing
reversals
out.
of alliances.
Absolutely. So, Boris is perfectly right. So I told you in the beginning that you had two sides of the coin to understand contemporary Armenia. You had the movement for Karabakh and you had the national independence movement of Armenia. And so for, let's say, up until 2018, the internal political teams of Armenia based a big chunk of their internal legitimacy, power, oligarchic networks, everything, what may, on the Karabakh question. And Armenians made a lot of choices, strategic choices, in order to answer to the necessities given by the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, the Russian alliance, but also in 2013, the choice not to sign a SEPA agreement with the European Union, but to go to the Eurasian Economic Union, which was explicitly done for Nagorno-Karabakh, for the security of Nagorno-Karabakh. In 2018, you have a Velvet Revolution in Armenia, which is a civil society movement, peaceful, that puts down the president that had been in power for 10 years, the last 10 years, 2008, 2018, and you have a new prime minister that is not taking power, but that wins, if you want, power on the wings of that social movement. And Armenia starts to democratize gradually. It's obviously a process in the making, with back and forth. But still an active process. And Russia was not very happy with that development. Although Armenia was very prudent and careful and said that the Velvet Revolution didn't mean that Armenia was changing its alliances, that it was not making a pivot to the West, but still Russia was not benefiting as much from the new elites in Yerevan as it was benefiting from the old elites in Yerevan, who were completely pro-Russian anyway, so that would be the answer to your question. So obviously now with all this crisis between Yerevan and Moscow, one aspect of the question is to get rid, for Moscow, to get rid of this democratic, too much Western styled, so on and so forth, government in Armenia, and to put back guys on which we can rely more solidly. From Moscow's point of view, obviously you understand that it's not my point of view.
Thank you. It is striking when you see the negotiations, international meetings with all the government leaders, and when you see the Armenian Prime Minister surrounded by people like Lavrov or Putin sometimes, or Aliyev, or the Turkish one, Erdogan. So Armenia also is isolated as a weak state, a weak democracy, surrounded by authoritarian, if not even worse, regimes. And this is also...
Perfectly right.
I have a question about Iran. What role do you foresee Iran playing in the future with Armenia?
In the future?
Coming into its defense or not, possibly? I'm not sure.
Coming into its defense, you mean militarily?
If Sunik is attacked, let's say.
No.
No way?
No, I don't think so. And I mean, what would be the price to pay for that? Be careful what you wish for.
No, maybe they don't want Iran to. Maybe Iran doesn't want Azerbaijan to have that.
They don't want.
Right.
But I mean, it's not
like
because you don't.
How much of a role would they play to?
It's not because you don't want that you're going to intervene militarily, right? It's two different things.
Just curious.
Yeah.
Aren't they building a road south of Sunik across from Nakhchivan to Azerbaijan proper? Isn't there a negotiation now over
In Iran.
in Iran?
Yes.
Through Iran that bypasses Hayastan?
Absolutely, there is. It's in construction. Yes.
Is this being constructed?
Yes.
So they don't really need a
They don't.
Trans-Sunik road.
No. It would be shorter. It would be shorter, but they don't.
Okay, can I ask my question? Hi. So basically after the 44-day war, Russia basically brought Armenia and Azerbaijan together, and in the end they decided to place Russian peacekeepers in Artsakh. And I was wondering what role the Russian peacekeepers played in all of this, because as an Armenian, I didn't really hear much about that. And especially when Stepanakert was being bombed, I never heard anything about Russian peacekeepers intervening, trying to protect the people. So what is your opinion on their role?
They have not intervened. I explained during my talk that that Azerbaijan is used as a proxy by Russia in order to accommodate its interests with Turkey and Azerbaijan. And the role of the peacekeepers, quote unquote, in Nagorno-Karabakh has been very passive. The only thing that they have done is that they have not let people die of hunger, right. But they have never retaliated to disruptions of ceasefire. Since 2021, there have been multiple cases. They have not intervened when civilians have been shot. A guy on his tractor, I don't know, doing agricultural work. There have been cases, and in the very last days, we can say that they have escorted safely Armenians outside of Nagorno-Karabakh, but they have not prevented neither the bombings, nor the casualties, nor anything. So they have basically used their presence in Nagorno-Karabakh as a leverage to weigh on Armenia through Nagorno-Karabakh. And now the whole question is, what will these interposition Russian troops in Nagorno-Karabakh become? Are they going back to Russia? And in that case, please take the road from Azerbaijan to Russia. Or will they try to go to Armenia? And we know that there are discussions that are going on not open discussions, but that there is pressure that is exerted on Armenia to that effect. Other questions?
I have a question about the territories that have in pink and orange that have been taken away. What is the situation of people there?
Not good.
And they left. They've been killed. Who's living there?
Obviously, you had casualties, but what you have now is Azerbaijani armed forces that are building. They have already built them trenches. So they are fortifying their new positions. So they're creating a new line of contact that is different than the border. Okay, from people's perspective, for example, peasants, they have a major problem since 2020 because they have lost many pastures. So often, whether in the south or in the east, they can't live off their activity anymore, or it has becoming harder. Jermuk, which is a resort that is just here, it's a touristic resort, is suffering very much because just a few kilometers away you have Azerbaijani forces. And people, well, they're not very comfortable going on vacation in their resort town. Yes, of course, it was shelled in September. Yes, thank you. So that's the situation. It's a complicated situation. Of making Armenia a gray zone. You're making it a gray zone. Sorry, there was Boris John. There was a question just.
Yeah, just how much? Wait, how do I want to word this? Do you think that the timing of the most recent attacks in September have anything to do with Russia being bogged down in Ukraine?
I cannot tell you about the exact day. I mean, if it was.
But I mean, in general, like, do you think Azerbaijan was like, well, let's take advantage of the fact that Russia's.
Yes, in general terms, yes. In general terms, the situation of Russia on the Ukrainian front has repercussions in what is going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan. As to the exact date, I don't know. But we know they knew. We know they knew, and we know they didn't oppose. Boris, you wanted to say?
How do you interpret the Russian laissez-faire in Karabakh in the last month? Since they accompanied the ethnic cleansing, finally they didn't do anything else than accompanying the process. But we heard many times from many sources that the Russians were here since 2020. It was their victory to be positioned with their forces as a key element in this area to keep a control. And so the pretext was to protect the civilians in a way. Since the civilians have been expelled, so what is the argument? How can they remain in the area? As you said, they would probably not remain in the area. So finally, this laissez-faire, this abandonment of Armenia and Karabakh, in the meantime, they lost their leverage on Armenia, the leverage we are talking about. So what is their interest?
Yes, they have lost leverage. They have lost political capital because Armenians don't trust them anymore. And yes, they have lost one important leverage with this laissez-faire in Nagorno-Karabakh, but at the same time, if you think that they're hoping to transfer, I would say, the leverage they had over Nagorno-Karabakh on Armenia proper, then it makes sense. And it would be a strategic shrinking because Russia is weakened, but it doesn't want to go out of the South Caucasus, right? And it will not go out anyway. So it's a strategic shrinking in a way. Well, that's the way I'm seeing it. So you shrink on Armenia proper, and you make a retreat. But they can be more in Armenia. Armenia is trying to lessen, right, the Russian leverage. So it's the time not to let that happen.
Hi. I don't want to bring up a whole other big topic, but I wonder if you can speak a little bit about Turkey's role in this, and if there is one, or maybe it's not as strong as people in in our community talk about it, but what is the impact or aid or future of, is there something there or not? Keep it brief, I know you're tired.
No, it's not a matter of tired, but we all know that Turkey, Azerbaijan, they are strategic partners. After the 44-day war, there was a declaration in Shusha, a common declaration that built an even stronger alliance between Azerbaijan and Turkey. So 2021 and 2022, that alliance received, other than military, it received déclinaison in the domain of history and in the domain of foreign policy. History is very important, by the way, and I'm already starting to see how this, can be expressed. And for example, one illustration, very concrete. In a few days or weeks from now, I have seen the announcement of an event in a university in Turkey about Western Azerbaijan, Western Zangezur, and on the right to return. We are almost in a state of complete integration in many aspects. And we also know that there was a common center of observation monitoring of the ceasefire that was set up in Ardam in 2021, a Turkish-Russian center. Nothing has transpired of their activities or reports or what do they observe or don't observe, but we understand that everything that is going on in that region is consulted between Russia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan. And if I need to put it very simply, Armenia is paying the bill for accommodation of interests of these three players. So that's the role of Turkey. But it's very discreet, I would say. In 2020, Turkey was at the forefront, and I think it has tried to sort of mellow a little bit that posture. But when you read the Turkish media, the ideology and the phraseology of the Azerbaijani government and the Zangezur corridor, for example, is a key word. And it's an objective that Turkey is taking for itself as much as for Azerbaijan. Erdogan has talked about this at the United Nations just days before or at the same time. I'm starting to mix chronology of recent events because I am too focused on these events and everything is happening at the same time, but that's the picture.
So I work as a journalist, and I'm relatively new to the profession. Hello? Yeah, okay. So while covering this topic, I've had some questions, journalistically speaking, and I want to know your opinion as an academic. Journalistically speaking, I would say that Armenia says what's happening here is ethnic cleansing. Clearly it is. And then afterwards also mentioned that Azerbaijan says that it's not. Do you think as academic, as your opinion, should that part, what Azerbaijan is saying, this is not an ethnic cleansing, shouldn't even be in there, especially when there isn't a lot of coverage of this. A lot of people don't know what's happening in the region. So I just want to know your academic opinion on that.
No, not necessarily, but I think the journalists should do so much preparation work in order to sort of, be confident, that they know the subject well enough so that they are not subject to manipulations by the discourse, because it's so easy to do both sidism and to say one is saying this, one is saying that, and we don't really know. So what Azerbaijan is saying should definitely be in the columns so that people know what they are saying, but then it should probably be shown under such a light that we also understand what is really going on, right?
So you would say that with all the facts that are out there on what happened, plus the attacks that are happening, once all of that information is out
yes, I mean, trust the reader, but give the reader all the information that he needs to have a well-formed opinion, right, about what is going on. Yeah.
Okay, so let's say after the estimated or approximate 100 plus thousand Armenians from Artsakh came out and were refugees to Armenia. So we know that after the Ukraine and Russia war, or during it, many Ukrainians and Russians fled to Armenia to find somewhere safe to live. Do you think that that will be the same case for the citizens of Artsakh, or do you think that over time, just as a personal prediction, they will become like the diaspora and be forced to move out, just like after the genocide?
I hope they will not, because we know that Armenia has a massive demographic issue, and that 100,000 people, I mean, in every Dharma you have challenges and opportunities that arise, right? 100,000 people is 3% of the population in Armenia. So strategically speaking, the best case scenario would be to integrate, and especially to integrate in the border regions. Easier said than done. And the Armenian state doesn't have neither the experience nor the institutions that will allow it by itself to handle this issue. So in order to do that properly, Armenia needs to work smartly with humanitarian agencies, international organizations, international donors, and so on and so forth, so that things that have happened to Armenians from Lebanon, Armenians from Syria, Armenians from Armenia also that fled, don't happen with Armenians from Artsakh. But that's not a prediction, it's just a wish.
Thank you. Is there a last question, anybody? This has been a really excellent discussion. Right. Thank you so much, Taline, for your talk.
Thank you, everyone.